"You don't belong here," the racist Karen said, not knowing that she just made the biggest mistake of her life. The first-class cabin of Western Airlines Flight 407 hummed with hushed luxury, its leather seats bathed in the dim glow of reading lamps. Amara Whitaker, 12, adjusted her beret and smoothed her navy blazer, her reflection flickering in the oval window. Outside, storm clouds bruised the sky, but inside, the air smelled of polished wood and privilege. Her fingers traced the embossed title of her grandfather's gift, Invisible Wings, Memoirs of a First Officer, as the seatbelt sign chimed. To the silver-haired man across the aisle, she was a curiosity, a child alone, clutching a book too thick for her age. To the flight attendant eyeing her braids, she was a question mark. A designer heel clacked down the aisle. "Excuse me," came a voice sharp as a scalpel. "This seat's taken." Amara looked up. Mrs. Cartwright, a woman with a fox fur scarf and a mouth like a loaded gun, loomed over her, boarding pass in hand. Her perfume cloyed like wilted roses. "The flight attendant confirmed my seat," Amara said, her voice steady despite the storm in her ribs. Mrs. Cartwright smirked. "Confirmed." She laughed, loud enough to turn heads. "They'll let anyone print a ticket these days." The flight attendant hovered, silent. Amara's grip tightened on her book. "Hold your head high," her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. "Even when the world tries to weigh it down." But the world was trying. The flight attendant, a man named Carl with a name tag slightly askew, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the system shows Amara's seat as 3A. There's no error." Mrs. Cartwright's laugh crackled like static. "Error." She leaned into the aisle, her fox fur scarf brushing Amara's arm. "Sweetheart, this section's for priority passengers." "You're clearly 12, Amara interjected, spine rigid. "I'm 12. And my grandfather booked this seat." Carl shifted, avoiding her gaze. "Perhaps we can find you a new seat in coach." Mrs. Cartwright's husband, Bradley, drawled from behind her. His polo shirt strained over his gut. "Honey, why don't you sit with the help?" Amara's throat tightened. "Breathe," she told herself. "Grandfather said they'll try to shrink you. Don't let them." Mrs. Cartwright snapped her fingers under Carl's nose. "Well, fix this." Carl hesitated, then gestured to the cockpit. "I'll consult the captain." As he retreated, Mrs. Cartwright sank into the empty seat beside Amara. "Grandfather, she purred. "Bet he's so proud." Her fingers plucked at Amara's book. "Or does he even know you're up here?" Amara stared straight ahead. The storm outside rumbled, mirroring the one in her chest. Mrs. Cartwright's laughter sharpened. "Invisible Wings?" She snatched the book from Amara's lap, flipping it open. "How quaint. Does your grandfather read you bedtime stories too?" Bradley guffawed. "Maybe she's his charity case. Bring a kid to first-class day." Amara's nails dug into her palms. "Breathe. Grandfather said anger is a fire. They want to see you burn." Mrs. Cartwright tossed the book onto the empty seat. "Tell me, Amara," she drawled the name like a curse. "Does he even know you're here? Or did you sneak in while he was napping?" The storm outside rattled the windows. Amara's voice stayed level. "He booked this seat." "Booked?" Mrs. Cartwright leaned closer, her breath hot with mint and malice. "Honey, Reginald Whitaker doesn't waste first-class seats on handouts." A beat. Amara's heart stuttered. She knows his name. "Oh, you recognize the name?" Mrs. Cartwright smirked. "Of course you do. He's our kind of people." "Not." She gestured to Amara's braids. "This." Carl reappeared, pale. "Ma'am, the captain says." "I'll tell you what the captain says." Mrs. Cartwright stood, blocking the aisle. "This child is a disturbance. Either she moves, or I do. And trust me," her smile turned venomous, "you don't want the latter." The cabin held its breath. Amara's vision blurred. "Hold your head high." But the weight was crushing. Mrs. Cartwright's voice dropped, a venomous whisper. "Tell me, Amara, Does your grandfather even know you're playing dress-up in his world? The cabin seemed to tilt. Amara's chest burned. Grandfather said the world would try to bury you. Dig anyway. Answer me. Mrs. Cartwright snapped, leaning closer. Or are you just another charity case? A token? Is there a problem here? The words sliced through the tension. Every head turned. Amara's breath caught. That voice, steady, familiar, echoed in her bones. Mrs. Cartwright paled. Why, you're... Reginald Whitaker stood in the aisle, his navy blazer crisp, his silver hair catching the cabin lights. His gaze locked onto Mrs. Cartwright. Amara's heart thundered. No, not yet. Wait, this is your granddaughter? Bradley sneered. Looks like a... Reginald's eyes flicked to him. One look. Bradley silenced mid-sentence. Mrs. Cartwright's scarf trembled. Reginald, surely this is a misunderstanding. Amara, he interrupted, kneeling beside her. His voice softened, but carried. Are you all right? The storm outside roared. Reginald's question hung in the air. Are you all right? Amara straightened, her voice clear above the storm. I'm fine, grandfather. She met Mrs. Cartwright's widened eyes. But she seems confused about where I belong. The cabin froze. Mrs. Cartwright's scarf slipped from her trembling fingers. Reginald's gaze never left the woman. Is that so? Amara stood, her small frame unyielding. She thinks my seat's a mistake. That I'm a disturbance. She infused the word with quiet venom. Reginald's jaw tightened. How curious. He stepped forward, his presence filling the aisle. You see, Amara's seat, his tone chilled, was my decision. Mrs. Cartwright opened her mouth, but Reginald raised a hand. You interrupted my flight, he said. You harassed my granddaughter. And now, his smile was ice. You'll apologize. Or you'll leave. Bradley lunged forward. You can't. Sit down. The command cracked like thunder. Bradley obeyed. The cabin's air thickened. Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted to Reginald's lapel. A silver Western Airlines pin glinted beneath his blazer. Her throat bobbed. Reginald Whitaker. Every passenger leaned in. Carl, the flight attendant, blanched. Mr. Whitaker? The CEO. Reginald's smile was glacial. The very same. He stepped closer, towering over Mrs. Cartwright. You've heard of me, I trust? Your husband's firm lobbied against my diversity initiatives last quarter. Mrs. Cartwright's hands shook. I didn't realize. Reginald's voice cut like a blade. You knew my name. You knew this airline's values. Yet you chose to attack a child. He gestured to Amara. My child. Bradley lunged forward. Now, see here. You'll address me as Sir, Reginald snapped. And you'll both disembark in Phoenix. Permanently. Mrs. Cartwright's facade shattered. You can't. Do you know who we are? Reginald's eyes narrowed. I know you're trespassing on my aircraft. Carl scrambled forward, radio in hand. Ground crews waiting, sir. The storm raged. Mrs. Cartwright's scarf slipped to the floor, trampled underfoot. Reginald's voice cut through the cabin like a scalpel. Mrs. Cartwright, you've trespassed in more ways than one. He gestured to the storm-lashed windows. This flight is now diverting to Phoenix. You'll disembark there. Bradley surged forward. You can't. Watch me. Reginald's glare pinned him. Your wife harassed a minor. Threatened a paying passenger. On my airline. He leaned closer, his whisper audible to all. Consider this a lesson in consequence. Mrs. Cartwright's composure shattered. Do you know who we are? Our family knows nothing of consequence. Reginald turned to Carl. Inform the crew, effective today, the Cartwrights are banned from Western Airlines. Permanently. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Cartwright's face flushed crimson. You're making a mistake. This is racism. Amara stepped forward, her voice steady. "No, ma'am. This is respect." Reginald placed a hand on her shoulder. "Power doesn't apologize," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "It corrects." As the plane descended, police boarded. Mrs. Cartwright screamed obscenities, her fox fur scarf trailing like a defeated banner. Bradley followed, silent and sullen. Passengers filmed the spectacle, their earlier neutrality replaced by grim satisfaction. When the door sealed behind them, applause rippled through the cabin. Amara sank into her seat, trembling, but Reginald knelt beside her. "They doubted the ground beneath your feet," he murmured. "But you stood firm." The storm cleared as the plane ascended. Carl returned, offering a blanket and a genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for everything." Amara clutched her grandfather's book, its title gleaming in the light. Invisible Wings. Indeed. 6 months later. Amara stood at the podium in Western Airlines headquarters, her grandfather's vintage pilot wings pinned to her blazer. The room erupted as she accepted the Whitaker Aviation Legacy Scholarship, her face splashed across Aviation Weekly. Behind her, a mural depicted Flight 407 Stormy Night. A girl, a book, and a man silhouetted against constellations. First-class cabins now bore embroidered seatbacks. Respect is the only first-class requirement. Flight attendants like Carl, now a supervisor, trained recruits in de-escalation and dignity. The Cartwrights' ban remained headline news, a cautionary tale for elitists. Amara traced the wing's pin, its edges worn smooth. Reginald's voice echoed in her mind. "Power corrects." At the hangar, she greeted Captain Reyes, Western's first black female pilot, who handed her a headset. "Ready to see the sky?" As the engines roared, Amara glimpsed her reflection, braids tied high, beret tilted just so. The horizon stretched endless, uncompromising. Belonging, she thought, isn't a seat assignment. It's a language the powerful earn. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone unfairly judged you based on appearance? Share your experience in the comments. If you enjoyed this and want more content on inspiring Black stories channel like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and remember, real courage is not fearing the consequences, but prioritizing justice over comfort.